Businesses and organizations now more than ever take hold of a voluminous amount of data. The question is, are they handling it well? And are they making those data work for them, or is it all sort of counterproductive? Now, to share with us some key industry insights, we have with us Praveen Kumar. He's the General Manager for Asia Pacific over at ASG Technologies. Good morning, Praveen, and welcome to the broadcast.
Good morning, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Praveen, let's kick off with a very quick review of ASG and what you guys are doing, especially in this pandemic. When we're talking about data management, we're thinking about a myriad of information, how long, tedious processes here. How does an organization stop information management from being such a big stumbling block, particularly in this period where there's so much going on, there's so much data being used up, even as, companies start moving their offices and their employees to start working from home?
Yeah, so ASG has been in the business of managing and helping customers manage their data and information across landscapes, across different platforms over the period of years. And one of the key things that we've noticed in the past decade is the information landscape has broadened, and there has been a high volume of data that's added every day. As you rightly said, since the pandemic, most customers have tried to work remotely, and the businesses have to cater to enable and engage with them digitally. And one of the surveys that we've done last year in Philippines showed that more than 40% of businesses in the Philippines are not digitally ready. So they're digitally distraught, which basically meant that they had data which they could collect but could not use. And a lot of customers who actually had data with them because of the increased volume could not understand what data is right and what data is wrong. Just to give you an example, one of the banks in the ASEAN region had data about consumers which said that most of the customers they had before the year 2000 were actually born in the 1900s in Afghanistan. But that's not true.
Wow.
Because that's how data was entered when you data entry things into the system. Like the first year you get is 1900, and then you go and say the first country that comes up is Afghanistan. So they go and start data entering that. Now, when you start using that data for marketing, for sales, for engaging, you end up with a lot of wrong data. Same goes in Philippines, where people keep changing mobile numbers, have a lot of mobile numbers with them. So you have to track whether you have the right contact. Otherwise, someone's trying to reach X person, you reach Y, and then you're spending a lot of time engaging. So we help customers in trying to identify where data could be wrong, how does data come from location A to location B, how can you fix it, and at the same time help them build processes that can help themselves be digitally enabled.
Okay, Praveen, just here, basically you're pointing to bad data here. So question now is, how does that cost, how much does that cost a company, and how does a group actually avoid it? Because sometimes really the problem with burst of information, especially when it's a, how does an
Yes.
organization actually solve that?
Yep. So you were a little choppy. I'll repeat the question just in case I understood you right. You could correct me if I did understand you wrong. What you were saying is
Sure.
most organizations have a lot of bad data. How much does it impact them in terms of revenue and productivity? And if it does impact them, how can they fix it? Is that the kind of question you asked?
Exactly, Praveen. Go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. So there was a Gartner survey done last year, which kind of said most organizations tend to lose about $10 million a year at the minimum, which could go right up to $100 million a year, depending on the size of the organization and what kind of data comes in and goes out. But the fact is, this calculation of how much does it cost the business depends on how much you use that data. So if you actually don't use data that you have collected, then the calculation of losses is fairly irrelevant. Many customers that we've noticed, except for financial institutions and maybe some manufacturing companies who have started going in the digital transformation journey, have a lot of data which they don't use. So the fact is, if you're not encashing the asset that you have, which is data, and I just heard the news article just before that oil has been dropping their prices and the volume of oil consumption is fairly low. Till last year we used to say data is the new oil. Now we don't no longer say data is the new oil because the value of data has not gone down. It's in fact gone up. So data is far more expensive than oil now. And the fact is, if data is more expensive than oil, you've got to use it. So what is an example of using wrong data and how much does it cost? As I give you the example of one bank having to see data which says most of my customers before 2000 were actually born in 1900s and born in Afghanistan. You have to clean that data. Now that data doesn't reside in one application, it resides in hundreds of them. So you have to go and clean each one of them and then do data mining and do market research and do targeted advertisement. So for example, if I, as a customer of a particular financial institution, I'm insured for 10 years and I'm not insured for the next 10, being it health, auto, or whatever, medical, the supplier needs to know that this is the customer where I can go and sell A, B, and C. So the ability to identify that and the ability to do data mining and advertisement on that is fairly expensive if I have wrong data. And that's where bad data comes in. So if you look at impacts between 10 to 100 million, in fact, there was an IBM research that said you could be yearly losing about $1 trillion plus in terms of data costs for companies because of bad data. So if you go back and see and rejig, each customer and each vendor would try to portray their own numbers. The way to fix it is to kill the data bad quality at source. So if we can identify where data is coming from, and how can it be fixed, then you've actually killed that bad data moving into 20 different locations and then trying to fix them. The second thing is to put a process together which can track how data is flowing within the organization and also have a digital transformation system or an application which can help you in that journey, both of which ASG can help customers achieve.
Praveen, I'm gonna have to jump in here, and it's interesting that you're actually here today because of all of these issues going on in the banking sector, which you had mentioned earlier on, particularly with the FinCEN issue. And this is also an issue about data, right? Data which had been existing for decades, really, that has just come to the forefront of the news right now. So this is also a concern on data security. When we talk about data, how do you make sure that we're not violating any privacy norms here? There's proper data governance when it comes to compliance and security, without, of course, jeopardizing the security of banks, the security of data privacy of people.
Yep. So you've raised a very interesting question. So the problem of bad data is not something that's happened in this decade. The Enron scandal, if you go back to the Enron scandal, is all a fact of bad data. Or you go to the NASA issue before the Enron scandal in the 1990s, that was also bad data. So the bad data problem has existed for quite some time. Today, we have the methods to identify bad data and fix them. So coming back to the question that you raised in terms of banking issues that have been come to the fore yesterday, at least in the Philippines, and we'll restrict this communication to the Philippines for now. The Philippines Data Privacy Act that was introduced, I think, a couple of years back, does have penalties around how data is actually used, demonstrated, and shared across enterprises within the country or outside. There are penalties if you misuse them. So you could have imprisonments between 1 to 3 years. There are penalties of between 500,000 pesos to, I think, 2 million. I don't have the numbers right, but something around that, where enterprises have been told that these are the norms you need to follow. And if some customer says that my data is private, don't tend to reuse it. The European Union came with a very strong act of GDPR a couple of years back, which has very hefty penalties, which are directly related to the revenue of an organization, not necessarily to the volume of issues that you have. And it's not only about the organization itself. So if that organization, and you take a bank, for example, if a bank in Germany decides to subcontract its call center to Philippines, or its back office processing center to some company in Philippines or India, and that company leaks data, this bank is held responsible, or this financial entity is held responsible. So the GDPR Act goes not only about Your responsibility is your entity. It goes to your subcontractors, your outsourcing entities, your partners, etc., where your data is getting
Right.
manipulated, shared, and reused. So yeah, this is a challenge in terms of what data is shared and how it can be shared and how it can be reused. But governments across the world are trying to bring together norms which define what data privacy is and how it can be enforced. Now, the issue is how enterprises can enforce those regulations and be compliant with them, which is where we bring in solutions which have data management, information management, tracking compliance, and enforcing them within the organization in identifying where such leakages could happen.
All right, Praveen. And that moving forward, and very quickly now, how does one make a
President
data-centered
Rodrigo
culture
Duterte
across
lashed
an
out at
organization?
critics of the
And
government's
how does it go
COVID-19
beyond
response
the walls
efforts
of an IT
during his public address last.
So data is not an IT asset. Data is a company's asset. And everybody, if they accept this particular information, then it becomes easy. As long as a company keeps trying to make data an
Alright, thanks
IT
for that,
problem,
Marcel. That was
you'll
Maricel
always find
Halili
that
reporting live from
solutions are
Mandaluyong.
related to IT
We'll be
infrastructure,
back with
data
more stories
centers,
after a quick break.
PCs,
Keep it here.
antivirus software, anti-malicious information management
during
software.
his
As
public
long as
role
you start making data an
Alright,
asset,
so
and
there's
which
a
is where
reckoning date.
not only
So
the GDPR but also the
outside
Data Privacy Act in
already
Philippines
some
says
choice
you need to
words
have a
for
chief data officer. What we've noticed is a lot of companies hire a chief data officer under a CIO. Now that again becomes an IT problem and not a company problem. So the day you decide that data is an asset for the company, which a lot of banks, a lot of insurance companies, and a lot of manufacturing entities globally have started enforcing within their organization. The CDO literally reports sometimes to the CEO or the COO in terms of handling the business, then it becomes an easier issue. I'll give you a case in point. So in banks, you fill a form which has a customer name, a date of birth, and something else. If I say that data is an IT problem, I can tell you there are 500 applications within a bank which will store customer name not as customer name. It'll store customer name, customer ID, login, blah, blah, blah. Now, IT will say, yes, it's all secure, it's all perfect. But someone in the business has to say that the customer name should not be more than 30 characters. It should have starting with capitals and end with this. It should have a first name and a last name. So this is not defined by IT. IT defines based on their applications. This is defined by the business. And customer name is one attribute or a critical data element for data. Similarly for date of birth, similarly for income, blah, blah, blah. So the example of trying to make data an IT problem and then say, okay, what IT solutions can I have to fix it is a very narrow-minded solution which will solve your IT issues, but not your organizational data landscape, which is where having an owner for data, which is from the business and encompassing the larger organization in terms of data management becomes a lot more critical.
Thank you so much. Of course, as you mentioned, data is the new oil. So trying to find more ways to monetize on that asset. That was, of course, Praveen Kumar, General Manager for Asia Pacific at ASG Technologies. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Dan and Jess. Thank you.